In today's episode, we're going to be talking about cannabis jobs and careers. And essentially, I want to put this forward so that different companies and individuals know what to plan for when it comes to the cannabis industry. Now, in South Africa, we've had rather a nascent industry, which means it's rather new. It's only been about 4 years of legalization. We're going to focus on licensed cultivation due to the framework within South Africa. However, this will apply globally in terms of licensed cultivation. We will, however, also talk about, plant touching industries. So anything associated to jobs related to the plant directly, as well as what is plant facing. So these are activities that support cultivation activities, extraction activities, etc. with the plant. So things like HVAC specialists, facility design, the ISO paneling, HVAC, the whole assortment of even laying the foundation in the facility. That is related to plant facing. And in this, I want to kind of just give you an idea of the type of jobs that you can anticipate. And most of this will be focused on licensed cultivators. So where there's real facilities focused on mass cultivation, mass packing, maximum export, all for the international market. Now, in a facility, the first and foremost thing is a head grower. So there's a couple different definitions that can be applied to a head grower, but it's someone who's got more than, typically 10 or 20 years experience at cultivation at scale. So really hundreds of plants, thousands of plants. It's one thing to cultivate a couple dozen plants and call yourself a head grower. It's a completely separate issue to be doing this at scale when your yields are not just a few kilograms, but tens of kilograms, hundreds of kilograms for that facility in a harvest. Now, the head grower's responsibility is often to capacitate those around him, or her. So essentially looking at the ability to train up cultivation technicians to also give that individualized focus to the plant. The reason being is we've seen the cases where too much automation is applied to large Canadian facilities, and that often doesn't work out well in terms of the plant yield and also the quality of the flower. So this is an important aspect, and to help the head grower really be effective, we often look at having someone who's responsible for the facility itself. Now, that might be the responsibility of the head grower in the beginning, but essentially a facilities manager is someone who's trying to take care of the more mechanical aspects around the facility, the air quality, checking that. They'll obviously maybe involve themselves with compliance, or let's just call it a quality assurance manager, but they're responsible for the utilities, the facility itself, making sure the air, the water, everything is operational, the power distribution is working, that there's no challenges that really take away time from the head grower. In addition, you have someone usually in stores or inventory, depending on the scale of the operation, that's really looking to support the operation. So the ability where they know what's in inventory, that's stored, when does it need to move to dispatch, what's coming in receival, do they need COAs, certificates of analysis for the materials that are coming in. If it's a pharmaceutical type of licensed cultivator, they might also have that in quarantine, and that quarantine will only allow itself to be dispatched and taken into stores once it's had the necessary checks, so quality assurance checks. So that's often the roles, and this will kind of overlap to some extent with some of the other jobs I'm going to mention now. When it comes to the trimmers or the post-harvest technicians, these are usually individuals that will handle material post-harvest. Now, in a GACP, Good Agricultural Collection Practices environment, someone will be, primarily the head grower and his team, will be responsible for cultivation. In a GMP side of it, the head house, they may then get that material coming through a material airlock. They'll receive that and then process that. So essentially dry the material, check moisture, check humidity, potentially do some curing. Perhaps they cure in the package in itself. They'll be doing the trimming. So it depends on how you're going to look at this process. I mean, a lot of technicians involved. If it's hand trimmed does give a better quality of flower. But increasingly, there are some good automated trimmers that allow you to cut back on some of those requirements in terms of labor. So these are the kind of jobs you will see, and I think in South Africa it's appropriate to have a lot of hand trimming because we don't really have a massive cost base for this type of career, and it does create jobs, and this country is in desperate need of jobs. There's also the compliance officer. So there's someone who's always going around checking compliance. And compliance is really a cultural aspect of a business where everyone needs to embrace compliance, and the reason being ultimately to produce a safer and more repeatable product for the end user. But someone's going around checking SOPs, so standard operating procedures, making sure that surfaces are properly cleaned, making sure that things are properly weighed, labeled. So basically reporting back to what would be the QC, quality control, and QA, quality assurance managers. So let me discuss those now so you have a better idea of what their form and function is. So essentially the QA manager or the QC manager is someone who's really doing a lot of the quality checks. In the case when you receive products, they would also make sure that that product coming into the facility, if it needed a COA, has one. It would also do, if you're weighing off products, it would check those forms, make sure that the right weight is captured, teared onto the actual scale. They're responsible for checking on these things. They also will be involved often with the lab technicians in terms of things like if you have to do microorganism checks, if you need to do checks on the final product release, they'll work with the lab technicians to make sure that those QC requirements are in place, essentially ensuring the air and the water in the facility is of adequate standard. The quality assurance managers, they're basically that extra set of eyes that looks at the process, looks at the facility, and makes sure and double checks what's coming out from QC. They may also be responsible for amendments and adjustments to like a quality manual, where they are essentially looking and writing and updating and modifying SOPs. You can have someone within that team, or it could be a big team that's modifying and improving up on standard operating procedures, but essentially it's the QA manager that does a lot of that work. And basically the QC and the QA manager often report to the site's responsible pharmacist, who's really just an approved pharmacist for the site, that has to be the final signature on the release of the product, especially within the prescription medical framework. The other thing to consider when you're hiring a responsible pharmacist, and I'm going to highlight the difference between what's called an industrial pharmacist and a retail pharmacist. Essentially, a retail pharmacist is someone who goes around and normally dispenses medicine to the public, has been trained as a pharmacist, but they're not often involved in the quality assurance and just the manufacturing of medicine. An industrial pharmacist, however, is someone who works at traditionally a big pharmaceutical company. They might be doing oral solid dosage forms, so like tablets, capsules. They may be doing sterols for injections, drips, any kind of intravenous type of product. So that's someone who really understands batch manufacturing records, products, what their requirements are to go to market. Whereas the retail pharmacist is more abundant, so probably about 95% of pharmacists are retail, whereas industrial pharmacists actually has the kind of experience you would want in a cultivation facility. And in that space, there's going to be a big price differential between them. So when you are recruiting a responsible pharmacist for a facility, you just got to weigh up the experience as an industrial pharmacist versus a retail pharmacist. Now, business development is something I have to spend a bit of time talking about, because there's often, and I see this all the time, where facilities spend tens of millions getting into building a facility, going for GMP, but they haven't spent enough time on the business development. And what I mean by that is the relationship of the product and ultimately its route to market. In South Africa, we have really two routes to market. The one primarily is getting an offtake agreement, supplying internationally your product. So it's that typical model we've seen around the world, where it's cultivation for the express purposes of export, and that tends to be the bulk of the route to market. There is, however, this increasing route to market, which is through Section 21, and I'll talk about that in a moment, which is just, if you compare it to Australia, like special access schemes. So it allows patients in the country to get access to local products, also international products, through a specific special access scheme. And that's also something that needs to be developed. If you're looking to tap into that supply chain, you need to know who's collaborating in that space and who to deal with in that space to essentially facilitate Section 21 buying and transactions within your company. And primarily the big one is understanding the international offtake arena and the spacing, and which countries are open and viable to that. So this is often a big gap in organizations, but it's critical to the success of cannabis cultivators. We also have in cases where you set up for extraction as an extraction specialist. So ideally someone who's got a strong chemical or pharmaceutical background. It could also just be a BSc graduate. I mean, a lot of the extraction equipment nowadays is quite automated. So due to that level of automation, it makes it a lot easier for anyone to really operate it. However, at the end of the day, you are exploiting chemistry in this process. So having a fundamental understanding of chemistry and what could be going wrong with an extraction, if you're getting some problems that you need to troubleshoot, it helps to have a chemist. It also helps to have someone who's trained in GMP, good manufacturing practices, because they would essentially operate in a manner that avoids the product being unnecessarily exposed to potential contaminants, keeps the quality in check, essentially. The extraction chemist would also often work with what is called the formulation chemist. So formulation chemists are really focused on understanding, also a bit of that market dynamic. What does the consumer ultimately want from the product? They may work with the marketing side of the team or the business development side. They would also have a good understanding of things like stability, product stability specifically. So what makes for a good shelf life of a product? What kind of formulations are preferable by consumers? What can they maybe introduce that's proprietary to the company? So it also sometimes gets involved with the IP around the business. So this is someone to look for as well in a more mature extraction facility. We also have in just general facilities an analytical chemist and a microbiologist. This can be outsourced, so you could have someone who is specifically, labs that are compliant. So typically ISO 17025 labs or GLP, good laboratory practices labs, where you have service level agreements with these labs to supply your product for testing. They give you a result, and that result is obviously your final release. As your facility scales, and often when you're looking to optimize within a facility, it helps to have in-house analytics. So you may see the need for setting up an analytical lab. So essentially looking at, you might just start off with potency. So in that case, potentially looking to get an HPLC put down, or, if you're doing a GC, you have to derivatize. But, get potency going. You might do terpene profiling as well. Pesticides, heavy metals, aflatoxins, all of this starts to get more costly, but it is something to consider increasingly with time. I've done a few videos on extraction and testing, so be sure to have a look at that. And then again, like I said, you want someone who's an analytical chemist, because at the end of the day, they need to run this equipment. So if you're running HPLC, someone who's familiar with solvents, setting up and validating the method, doing a good sample prep. I mean, sample prep is at the heart of good testing. So doing reliable and consistent sample prep is definitely going to impact your analytical results. And then for the microbiologist, obviously a separate lab from the analytical lab. The main reason being, if you're complying to GMP, you got to know that you've got to keep the microorganisms completely isolated in that facility. So the microbiologist would need to work aseptically, so that means in a sterile manner, often within a laminar airflow hood. So here you can see they would have to prepare media. So if they're doing settle plates for the facility, if they're doing room checks, if you're doing ISO grading in the facility, they'll also potentially do final product checks. So that's someone else you would see within the lab for final release testing, specifically looking for aerobic bacterial presence or coliforms. And then you'd also be doing yeast and mold counts. And then tissue culture. Increasingly, we've seen a lot of facilities do have mother rooms where they specifically do cuttings, and they cut and root their clones. But increasingly, we also see the use of tissue culture. So just the ability to scale a lot quicker in agars. So you may essentially look at also having a tissue culture capacity within a modern cultivation facility. Now, of all these people that has been mentioned, you're definitely going to need an HR manager as well. So a traditional HR manager might also have quite a, let's call it, affinity to cannabis. And then there's opportunities that are slowly developing. And in South Africa, we've got around 60 cultivators that are licensed. So you'll see that these opportunities start increasing as the industry keeps expanding. And then everything you can think of. I mean, accountants, lawyers, usually you need a very good lawyer in the cannabis industry, because it's one way it's still overcoming destigmatization. And then we have security personnel as well. Often a highly secured environment is not just required in South Africa, but across different facilities around the world. Receptionists, international sales, local sales when you're going through Section 21, commercial consultants, cannabis recruitment might be a factor. You might even, technically even regulatory inspectors are getting employment in the industry by being part of the industry and actually going out inspecting these facilities. So those are essentially some of the jobs that are really focused on the facility side. So I'm glad, hopefully, you learned something about that. And then the cannabis prescribers. This is increasingly where it's also of interest. In South Africa, I mentioned we have Section 21. So this is approval through Section 21, which is within the Medicines Act, to allow you to get an unregistered medicine. Now, something to know about an unregistered medicine. You're not allowed to advertise unregistered medicines. You need approval by the regulator every time for the use of an unregistered medicine. So to go to a named patient for up to 6 months, the physician would have to report on that. And there's different platforms and physician networks that access or provide access through Section 21. Obviously, when you get a registered medicine in the jurisdiction for an indication, that would be the preference, and generally anyone could prescribe, or any physician could prescribe an authorized medicine. But for now, for unregistered medicine, there's Section 21. You also get these pharmacy and wellness approaches. There is a specialization, and there is this development that's happening within compounding pharmacy. When it comes to CBD wellness products in South Africa, anything under 600 milligrams and 20 milligrams per dose falls into what's called complementary medicines, or Schedule 0, and that can be sold at a Pick and Pay, a Spar, a Checkers, as long as the label claims conform to what's in the product and meets those requirements specified. For the private club model, I mean, this is essentially going back to the spirit and the ruling around the Constitutional Court ruling in 2018. There is, and it will probably be delayed, but let's hope that there is a resolution by the 6th of June regarding the Hayes Club ruling around whether or not a private club model can be used. Naturally, if there is a court ruling, it will set a new precedent for how to interpret the law. Won't gazette necessarily new interpretations, but at least it gives a bit of a mandate to what could be referred to. Dispensaries, we've seen this prolifically throughout the states and other jurisdictions, but the use of dispensaries in South Africa has not really worked out, primarily due to the interpretation that can be applied to cannabis still as a narcotic. So the amendment of the Drug and Drug Trafficking Act is really important to really open up potentially dispensaries in the space. I do think pharmacies might be the initial way to market if we're talking through access through Section 21. But let's hope. Ideally, we'd see some ideal responsible adult use legislation, and that would open up commercialization. So we talked a little bit now about plant touching, so really more direct with the plant. I also want to highlight plant facing because there's been a lot of success for companies that are plant facing, and essentially we are talking about guys that are setting, if you think about 60 facilities that have been built for inspections and gotten approvals, those greenhouses, those indoor facilities, whatever it was, the format for the cultivation, that's been built. So concrete has been laid for foundations, it's been set up, the HVAC has been put in, the RO water systems have been put in, a lot of money's been spent, and these are really the opportunities I'm talking about when I'm talking about plant facing. In addition, when we think about the fact that we can now privately grow in South Africa cannabis, a lot of plant support stores have opened up. So, growing stores, for lack of a better word. And we've seen also locally manufacturers of lights, nutrients, soils, amendments, all getting in the game as well, not just importing lights from China or from the US, but looking to manufacture their own lighting, manufacturing their own soils, their own nutrients. And that's a great opportunity. It's been a great growth sector, I feel, for the last 4 years. We've seen a lot of supporting equipment, a lot of supporting automation systems come up, seed companies coming into the space. Obviously, smoking accessory companies have flourished. So these are some of the opportunities that are also in the plant-facing side, and often you're not as heavily impinged upon in terms of regulatory conformance or regulatory compliance and waiting for approval from a regulator to be able to move forward with your facility or your extraction lab. So this is quite an interesting space. Greenhouse providers is naturally someone I'd highlight as well. The need for cooling and heating in the facilities, the dehumidification, the irrigation lines. If you're doing hydroponic, aeroponic, if you're growing through soil, these are all facilities, environmental monitoring. Everyone there has to come in, and it's usually quite technical, the personnel you need, especially if you're targeting higher efficiencies. And this creates jobs, which is a good thing. And then same for indoor ISO paneling, the coving for GMP if you're going for something a little more high-end, HVAC systems, RO, reverse osmosis water systems, epoxy for the flooring, automation, design work. So these are all careers that have been built. And then there's also the supporting labs. I've seen more and more labs interested in supporting the cannabis industry, not just from potency and heavy metals and aflatoxin and pesticide testing, but also microbial labs, looking at traditional releases, more to being aligned with potentially a monograph or a food standard. We also see incineration support services, especially when it's been insisted that, byproducts from the plant need to be destroyed, irradiation if it's required for jurisdictional export. So there's all these kind of industries that support around the cannabis cultivation facilities. I'm not going to tackle the industrial hemp and agro-processing sector in this discussion. There's going to be a plethora of opportunities in agro-processing and industrial hemp. That goes without saying. However, since late October of 2021, we've seen legislation come forward. There's going to be a need for massive focus on agro-processing in the space. That's going to create a lot of opportunity and businesses around it, specifically around decortication, hammer mills, the rest. However, we still want to maybe see some adjustments to the minimum THC for industrial hemp crop so that it's more viable in the region, especially considering how in Africa the epigenetic effects on, let's maybe call it a safe genetic, can be altered once you start commercializing. And then there's lastly, very forward-looking type of predictions of jobs and careers. I mean, if we do see responsible adult use dispensaries and we see the legislation to support that, that would be a lot of retail storefront. It would be online stores and opportunities. Bud tenders, as they typically mentioned, and this is something that always comes up as one of the first kind of cannabis careers. The ability to communicate to a consumer the benefits and the specifically benefits of a certain product provided in the store. We don't really see too much of that. Those jobs are around, but it's often a bit of a grey area. There's cannabis insurance, I mentioned recruitment, potential beverage industry involvement as well in the space. There's marketing services, and I think marketing services is highly dependent on a federal adjustment in the US, because a lot of the big marketing companies, YouTube, Facebook, these are based out of specifically the US, and they will be federally limited in terms of marketing services offered. But once we see federal legalization, we should see an opening up of the space. Naturally, you always have a situation where you have someone like an investment analyst. You'll see companies listing in South Africa on the JSE, Altex. So these type of opportunities will develop marketing services for videos, commercial products, product reviews. They will all come. But I think that will take some time until we have full commercialization. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. This video was basically focused on highlighting some of the career opportunities around cannabis, what is and what is not possible at the moment in South Africa as of the date of this recording. And hopefully I'll be back to talk about industrial hemp opportunities and jobs in that space. But I'd love to have any guests in that space with good expertise come on to talk about that in more detail.